Good morning, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the first day of the Affordability Summit, and I'm glad to see you all here today. It's a beautiful morning, a little crisp, but just another spring day in Wisconsin at 18. So just a couple of housekeeping notes, and we'll get rolling with our events for the day. Just a reminder that lunch will be back in here this afternoon, following the signs around. Grab your food and come back into the Great Hall. At lunchtime, Bobby Fields from Nicolet College, one of our planning committee members, is going to present this year's awards, and which you'll have a chance to vote on at lunchtime. Is that correct? After that, okay, super. I want to take a couple of seconds to thank some people. Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. This is our third or fourth year as a partnership. Started that partnership with Stephen Kelly, our keynote this morning, several years ago, and it has been a very wonderful partnership in helping to promote not only cross-river pollination, but just community and friendship in an event and an area that needs community and membership in order to support our students and faculty. So we really appreciate their support and their partnership. So thank you to them. I also want to make sure and thank the planning committee members that I alluded to. Would you please all stand up? Seems to me there are some people who are not doing it, but they're giving of their own time, and everyone knows that time is a resource that we don't have great amount of, but their ideas and their hard work make this event happen, and they make it successful. So we do really appreciate them. Also, I want to take a second to thank Scott and Hannah out at the registration table. Not only do they do registration day of, but they also help us with the operational items throughout the year, doing the contracts, paying the bills and things like that, and they're very much appreciated. Also, the great job that our Student Center support folks, the tech folks, the custodians, the food service people, again, they do such a great job, and they're so appreciated by us, and they don't hear it near enough. So if you get a chance, please tell them thank you as you're going through the day. Also to our unit, the University Library and administration, faculty, and students of Stout. Without you, we also couldn't do this. It is our passion to support affordability and access for students, and we couldn't do that without your community, your support, and your help in making this successful for us. So we do really appreciate that too. So if we could give all those people a round of applause. Also, we'd like to thank the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, who was a major donor for the conference this year. Finding resources is really important to us because one of the tenets that we have had since the beginning was keeping this a free event. The Tommy Thompson Center is delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and partner with the Effordability Summit Planning Committee. Thank you to the committee, to UW-Stout as our host, as well as the Thompson Center staff, Alex, Ruth, and Lily. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. They work to further these goals by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, honoring exemplary public leaders with Distinguished Public Leadership Award, and conducting other activities across all UW campuses. All events are free and open to the public. For more information on their upcoming events, grant opportunities, or aspects of the center, please visit the Tommy Thompson Center website. It goes without saying that they have made this year's event much, much easier and much more successful. So thank you to the Tommy Thompson Center. And to not minimize too, and I know Amber touched on this yesterday, but thank you also to our corporate and other sponsors who give of their own budgets when resources are tight to make sure that we can expand and provide this programming to you. Without them, we couldn't do it, and they're very much appreciated. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Now, with that being said, you're sick of listening to me, so I would like to introduce Kim Lynch, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Technologies and Development at Minnesota State, who will then speak to you and introduce this morning's keynote speaker. So welcome, Kim.
Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? Did you sleep well? Good, good, good. It's so great to see you. I love this group because there's typically, although I need to see a little more of it in the faces, a little more energy going on. We're going to have a great day. It's going to be super fun. As Bob said, I have really the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for today. And sometimes, you know, when I've been introducing and had that honor before, I've known of that speaker, but I haven't known that speaker. This is a really different thing. Like I am just overjoyed to be able to tell you a little bit about Stephen before he comes up here and wows you with his stuff. So he has had a huge impact on higher education already. If you don't know him now, you will know him. And of course, Minnesota State generally. I first connected with Stephen actually about 8 years ago at an e-learning summit where he was sharing some of the work that he had done with a TACT grant in, guess what, open educational resources, right? And so I somehow convinced his employer at the time, Century College, to let me buy out a little bit of his time to do some work with us on open educational resources and zero textbook cost degrees and so forth, and manage, well, again, that really grew into a relationship where he not only sort of took that work and ran, but he also wrote and has been managing our federal grant, our open textbook pilot grant, to bring teacher education resources to the community. So really exceptional work there. But you know what? That was just the beginning, because as you'll see, Stephen does not do anything by small measure. It is by big measure. And one of the things that he worked with us on is has a lot to do with his ability to be both future-looking and future-seeking. And he helped really a modest, what I would call a modest innovation grant program grow into a large annual event, bringing together communities of innovators and really funding hundreds of innovative projects across the Minnesota State system, including cutting-edge IT solutions, student success projects, virtual reality initiatives, and of course, open educational resources, to name a few. It was an amazing stretch, I have to admit. This past year, Stephen used his self-taught coding and development background, yeah, I mean, don't we all just do that, like teach ourselves how to do that, to create an elegant suite of tools to become what he labeled the Next Gen Business Solution Inventory. And what that was is an ambitious effort to gather data related to third-party software and business solutions from across Minnesota State's, count them, 33 colleges and universities, 54 campuses. We had never been able to do that before. Somehow, you know, we wanted to collaborate, but would you say like, well, who's using X, Y, and Z for their CRM, or who's using this? We don't know. Maybe you knew because somebody told you, but there was no unified way to do it. We now have that inventory, and we have a lot of information about how people are using those tools. But perhaps most relevant to his keynote today, Stephen organized the initial team of Minnesota State professionals who drafted the system's artificial intelligence guidance document. You know, that seems like maybe a minor thing, but this was actually a work cited in the EDUCAUSE Horizon Report, the Cybersecurity and Privacy Horizon Report. So it has gotten a little bit of attention, and it's a great document. That's an evergreen document because, as you all know, things are not slowing down in that space. He also, in collaboration with one of our colleagues, Elizabeth Harsma, launched the first artificial intelligence committee system-wide. And again, none of this is surprising because what you probably read in his bio is that he is a former member of the OpenAI GPT-3 beta testing community. And frankly, he was telling me, like, I don't know, 1 to 2 years before anybody had even heard of OpenAI, like, Kim, you gotta be on the lookout for this. This is gonna change everything. Literally, he said that to me many times. I didn't listen as well as I should have, but he did tell me. So that's on me. That's not on him. So as certain as many of us are now that generative AI may well change everything, I'm even more certain that the change train Stephen Kelly has started, it's like it's just leaving the station, and there will be much more to come from him. You may be hearing it here first, and don't minimize it like I did generative AI. So with that, please welcome innovator and educator extraordinaire, Stephen Kelly.
Good morning. Whew, I need to recover from that unbelievable introduction. I think never in my life have I ever felt so much in a position of, what more can I say about myself after that? My goodness. Thank you, Kim. Good morning. My name is Stephen Kelly. I am overconfident and undercaffeinated. This is my worst time of day. Welcome to it. Welcome. I'm going to share with you all today an amalgam of my experience from my childhood right up to the present. And I'm going to make some connections for all of us today that are likely things that you may have never thought about before. They certainly were not things that I thought about before until probably January, when I was thinking about, well, what am I going to do for a presentation at the Effordability Summit? This was only shortly after folks had reached out to me and said, would you be interested in coming and visiting with us about artificial intelligence? And I said, sure. I'm going to start out today by sharing with you a video. This is a game called Empires and Puzzles. This game has been around since, I believe, 2019. It's a little bit loud. We can turn down the volume just a little bit there. This is what on the surface looks like what's called a match 3 game. Match 3 games are where you line up the shields here and you are able to gain points by getting 3 or more in a row. You can get up to 5 shields in a row. The more shields that you get in a row, the more points you score. Four shields are better than 3 shields. 5 shields are better than 4 shields. If you can do 5 shields, you always want to do 5 shields. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that this player is very, very close to getting 5 blue shields in a row. Let's watch and see what happens. Things move around. We're going to send these shields at the bad guys up on top. Oh, look, up there, upper right-hand corner, 5 blue shields. Just move that 1 blue shield. You can do it. If we get those 5 blue shields, we are going to easily defeat this level. So here we go. Will the player do it? The player didn't do it. Why didn't the player do the 5 shields? It was the obvious move on that board. The reason why is because the player was artificial intelligence. In the upper right-hand corner, there was a button that was enabled, and it was the auto battle button in the game. This video was taken just several months ago. Why is artificial intelligence so bad at playing games? Why is artificial intelligence so bad at doing a lot of different things? Those are some of the questions we're going to ask ourselves today, and I'm going to do my best to reveal the answers to. So today we're going to talk about role-playing games, and we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, and we're going to talk about our education. We're going to talk about what these 3 different things have to do with one another, because on the surface, role-playing games and education seem very, very far apart. And we might think, oh, well, artificial intelligence is used in education now, and artificial intelligence is used in gaming, and that's what's going to bring them together. But there's more there than just the fact that artificial intelligence is now ubiquitous across both role-playing games and education. Let's talk about the ways. We're going to move through this in a narrative format because one of the things that I'd like to do today is tell some stories about my own experiences playing many of the games that I'm going to share with you today. And we're going to start out by just talking about RPGs and why they're unique. Because there's a lot of games out there, and not everyone plays RPGs. There's one particular kind of gamer, though, that likes to play RPGs more than others. RPGs are something that I grew up with during my childhood. A kid of the 80s, I had a Nintendo Entertainment System at the Christmas of 1987. And the first games that we got, in addition to the stock Mario Brothers Duck Hunt that you would get in the console at that time, was a copy of The Legend of Zelda. And I had been exposed to different kinds of RPG things before that, and I'll get into that, but The Legend of Zelda really started a journey for me in playing role-playing games that led into some of the other games I'm going to talk about today. What are role-playing games? Role-playing games are games that allow players to essentially take on the role of a character within a game and then embark upon adventures to increase the power of that character, increase the kind of interesting things about that character, right? And impress upon that character different kinds of skills, attributes, personality traits that the player chooses and I think are really interesting. Now, RPGs also are different than other games because they provide different kinds of systems within them that you don't usually see in other games. You might have heard of games that have RPG elements in them. Some of those elements include things like progression systems. They might include things like hit points. They might include concepts like rolling dice or random number generation. A lot of these things really find their home within RPGs themselves. Now, when we talk about RPGs, let's talk about the origins of RPGs. Here's a really interesting fact that many of you may not be aware of. RPGs were founded in two primary places, St. Paul and Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So let's take a historical run here and find out what the history is all about. And this is a image of 1966 in the basement of a gentleman named Dave Wesley in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dave Wesley is a gentleman right there with the glasses, the yellow sweater, yellow and blue sweater. And there's a gentleman I want to point out in the back who's hunched over the table there. His name was Dave Arneson. Now, these gamers back in the 60s were playing what are called tabletop war games. And you can see one set up here that they're all kind of huddled around. These games are set up on a big tabletop. You'd put together all the different scenery and structures, and you'd have all these little war legions and stuff. You'd move them around. You'd battle out historical battles from the Napoleonic era, from other eras. And these guys were really, really into it. I say these guys because you'll see it is all guys around the table here. There weren't a lot of women involved in this particular gaming group at the time. That did change, though, in the years to come. These folks many of them were students at the University of Minnesota. Dave Arneson, who's photoed here, was still in high school at this point in time. This was 1966. Now, during that time, they were also communicating with gaming groups that were down in Lake Geneva. And in Lake Geneva, there was a gentleman by the name of Gary Gygax that lived down there. We're going to hear a little bit more about Gary Gygax here in a second. But through those communications, they were able to connect and share stories about the games that they were playing together, both in St. Paul and down in Lake Geneva. They would travel back and forth in 1968 to something called Gen Con that was created. Have you heard of Gen Con? It's the largest gaming convention in the United States. That started in 1968 Lake Geneva. The St. Paul crew went down to Lake Geneva and were connecting with Gary Gygax and the crew down there. They exchanged notes on innovative things they were doing with gaming. And in 1970, Dave Arneson, the gentleman who was hunched over the table on the last slide there, who was in high school at the time, developed something called Blackmore. Now, Blackmore had been developed because Dave Wesley, the gentleman who owned the basement, he had developed something that he called Bronsteins. Bronsteins were tabletop war games where instead of just battling it out, the different kind of militaries on both sides of the table, individuals could take on the role of a character within the battle. Maybe it would be a junior lieutenant in one of the armies, a nurse in one of the villages, a mayor in one of the villages. And in addition to battling out on the tabletop, they could do side conversations and make up stories and different things that were going to happen while the war was underway, which would bring up then really interesting opportunities to develop things that we might call heroes, and people that would be involved and take actions that would have major impacts on the development of the wars that took place on the tabletop. Blackmore came out of those Bronstein games, and this was developed by Dave Arneson. And in Blackmore, this was the first time that players were allowed to take on the role specifically of an adventurer. So you could be a warrior, you could be somebody that dabbles in magic, you would join a party, you would go out, slay some monsters, go on an adventure. This might start to sound familiar to some of you in the room. He took this idea down to Gary Gygax in Lake Geneva and said, I've got this cool thing called Blackmore. Let me show it to you, and let's have a conversation about it. Gary Gygax loved Blackmore from Dave Arneson. And Gary Gygax pointed out two unique things about Blackmore that were different than all the games they had been playing. They were different from the tabletop war games they were playing. They were different from Monopoly and other things that were available out there that you could play for board games. And the two things were, one, multiple play sessions. The idea that you didn't just sit down to play the game and then you were done at the end. No, no, no. You were going to get back together again the next weekend and you were going to continue to play it and continue to play it. The adventure could go on for a long, long time. And the other unique thing about Blackmore was it had an experience system, sometimes also referred to as a leveling system or a progression system. And these two fundamental innovations in gaming are what brought about the eventual creation of Dungeons & Dragons. So again, Dungeons & Dragons itself, if you weren't aware, was founded in St. Paul in Lake Geneva. And Dungeons & Dragons has had a huge impact then on board gaming and indeed video gaming ever since. Let's talk about early PC gaming then. Dungeons & Dragons was developed in 1973. By the time we get to the early 80s, we start to see video games being created that are modeled after Dungeons & Dragons. Again, these video games likely would have never been created had Dungeons & Dragons not been created in 1973 because there was no foundation to create them, right? So there are two games that are often pointed to as the beginning of RPGs on video games. The first is something called Ultima, and the second is called Wizardry. These are similar but different in very important ways. Ultima 1 gives you sort of a top-down look at playing an RPG. You create a character at the beginning, you go out and you slay some monsters, but the thing that's really characteristic about Ultima 1 is it's what we call open world. Once a player gets in there, you can get lost. And I mean really lost. So lost, in fact, that you might give up, which is one of the drawbacks of some of the early RPGs being so open world, is that there wasn't always enough instruction on how to get from point A to point B to C to D and eventually beat the game. Wizardry was a slightly different kind of game. It was similar in that you create characters, but instead of having one character like in Ultima, you got to create an entire party. Now in Dungeons & Dragons, you often would get one character, and then you'd play with other players, and you'd create a party yourselves, but in Wizardry, you got to create 6 characters. And then you go running into a dungeon and start hacking and slashing a bunch of monsters. And what was very characteristic about Wizardry was that you got down into the dungeon, and you had a first-person point of view versus a above-ground point of view. Now, these early PC games then made a transition over to consoles. And this is where I want to talk about my childhood a bit and the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is what I grew up on. The conversion over to consoles created a lot of opportunities for innovation in RPGs, not least of which was a lot more publication of RPGs. And at this point in time, people were getting NES consoles much easier than they were getting PCs in their homes. For many of us in this room, you probably don't remember a PC in your household until at least the early mid-90s. So here we're talking 1986, 87. The two RPGs that really stand out here are one called Dragon Warrior and one called Final Fantasy. And Dragon Warrior, you'll notice it looks a lot like Ultima, doesn't it? It's a top-down view. You create one character. You move around the world. It's pretty open. You can get lost, and you can hack and slash. But Dragon Warrior learned from games like Ultima and made the actual progression and process of moving through the game a lot more straightforward. You didn't get lost nearly as often as you did in Ultima 1. Final Fantasy, in fact, And mind you, these games are both Japanese-created RPGs, whereas Ultima and Wizardry previously were American-made RPGs. The creators of Final Fantasy, they were such adherents to Dungeons & Dragons that they made all sorts of elements about Final Fantasy directly modeled after Dungeons & Dragons. And one of the ways they did this is a lot of games at the time would manage how players could use spells, spellcasters, magic, by giving them points, and then as you used a spell, the points would kind of tick down over time, right? But in Final Fantasy, they actually lifted the magic system directly out of Dungeons & Dragons and embedded it in Final Fantasy itself. I share this to illustrate that video games have always been modeled directly off a tabletop. There is a direct lineage there. And all of the influence we see in RPG video games comes directly from our tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. Now, RPGs are well known for doing something. And that is creating a lot of opportunities for gamers to get lost, not know what they're supposed to do next, and create barriers whereby if you don't figure out what you're supposed to do, you could feel hopelessly lost forever. And an example of that happens in Final Fantasy when you get to a little town called Elfheim. And in Elfheim, your players arrive, and your next stop afterwards is going to be the first major dungeon in the game called the Marsh Cave. Now, at this point in time, your characters are armed with things like short swords and hand axes, these weapons that you got at the last town. So in a lot of games, you'd think, okay, I'm going to progress to the next area of the game, and I'm going to kind of work my way through it. And you can try to do that in Final Fantasy. But if you do, you're very likely to die along the way. And even if you make it to the Marsh Cave, you're very likely to get eaten by the geists and the zombies and the other really naughty things that are down in the Marsh Cave. And so as a consequence, many gamers in the 80s would play Final Fantasy. They would get to this point in the game, and they would get so frustrated because they would die over and over and over again that they would just give up. But there were some gamers, and especially those gamers that talked to their friends at school who also had the game, and they would spread information about exactly what you had to do at this part in the game. And what you had to do if you wanted to get your way past this point in Final Fantasy is you needed to get the silver sword. But you wouldn't know that necessarily because it's in a small shop in Elfheim. And the key about the silver sword is that a lot of characters can use the silver sword. It's very accurate. It doesn't often miss its mark when you're in a battle with it. And it allows you to just cut right through the monsters that are on the way to the Marsh Cave and indeed in the Marsh Cave. The problem was that most of the times when you arrived at Elfheim, your party had about 200 gold coins. And how much does the silver sword cost? A lot. So the answer to that is you would have to spend an awful lot of time killing a lot of the same monsters to get more and more gold just to buy the silver sword so you could then go off to the Marsh Cave. And this would take hours sometimes to get that gold. And then you'd finally get the silver sword, and you'd notice that, oh, wait, another one of my characters can get the silver sword. So what do? Well, you spend a few more hours getting more gold to buy another silver sword. So you got two guys that have a silver sword, right? And if you have a third, well, you can see where this is going, right? You are spending hours just getting gold to get the silver sword so you can make your way through the Marsh Cave. Welcome to what is known as the grind. Final Fantasy, Dragon Warriors, and other RPGs were the games that introduced the gaming community to the grind. If you have heard the term the grind in the modern day, this is where it's coming from the original RPGs and the original gaming back in the 80s and the 90s. And the thing about the grind is that it's instances where you are repeating the same task within a game to get a reward, like the silver sword. You're going to kill monsters 100 times over so you can get enough gold to buy the silver sword. But you're not just doing it once. You're doing it again and again and again. Many, many times. There are many grindy examples in addition to Final Fantasy II. So let's talk about what those are really briefly. Ultima Exodus, 1987 on the NES. Really interesting. You build a party, you go out into the world, you start slaying monsters, all the kind of same stuff we know and love about RPGs. But here's the thing. In order to level up, you would go to Lord British, who was in the castle in the game, And Lord British would say, oh, if you've slain this many monsters, I'll level you up. And you think to yourself, well, that's great. That's what I want to do. We always want to level up, right? But here's where the insidious part comes in. When you level up in Ultima Exodus, all of the monsters in the world level up too. So what would happen to most players is you would go out and kill a bunch of monsters, thinking you're doing really well in this game. You'd go back to Lord British. He would level you up 5 times. You'd go back out into the world, and your party would be dead immediately. And you'd have to start the game over again. All fresh, because there was no way to unwind that kind of progress. So what gamers figured out is in order to get past this part in the game, what you had to do is keep your players at level 1. You had to go out into the world, use spells like Repel to kill goblins over and over again, buy all the best gear in the game, and then go level up. That process was about 10 hours. 10 hours you are not going to get back in your life, ever. But you know what? At least you were you're going to move on to beat the game, right? Another example is Dragon Warrior. The Green Dragon. The Green Dragon is an enemy that you meet in the game about level 6, and you don't know it's coming. It's hidden. So when you step on a certain spot in the game, you fight the Green Dragon. The Green Dragon is meant to be fought by somebody at level 12 or 14, and typically you're at level 6. So you can imagine how that goes. The way you beat the Green Dragon is you go out, and you spend a lot of time killing slimes and Dracos, and eventually you get powerful enough, you level up, and you can beat the Green Dragon. But gaining that much experience through slimes and Dracos takes hours. Hours to beat the Green Dragon. Hours getting ready just so you can fight the Green Dragon. Another example is the Bard's Tale on the NES. This one's a little different in that most games, what they do in RPGs is you'll make your party, you'll go out into the world, and the game will allow you to make quite a bit of progress in the game. But not in Bard's Tale. In Bard's Tale, you create your party, and the first place you're supposed to go to progress in the game narratively is protected by a statue of a wizard. And as soon as you touch the statue, the wizard comes to life, and it burns your entire party and kills you all. So the only way you can even start the game is to go around fighting goblins for hours and grind out some experience for your characters and get them leveled up so you can then, of course, fight the wizard and actually go to the first dungeon in the game. This is what the grind is all about. These repetitive tasks over and over and over again that, frankly, there's not many people that want to do this kind of thing. And it's fair to ask, who would want to do this kind of thing? Why would you want to grind hours doing the same thing over and over again? Isn't it just boring? 1 second. There is a particular kind of player who relishes this particular aspect of gaming. And generally speaking, if you look at all gamers who game, there are only about 5 to 10% of gamers that even fall into this category. And they do have a name. Now, their counterpart are what are often known as casual gamers. But these gamers, these are not casual gamers. These gamers are known as hardcore gamers. And we are a breed. We are a breed indeed. This is where the term hardcore gamer comes from. If you've ever heard that term, it is the gamers who are willing to grind. And there aren't many gamers who are willing to grind. RPGs were never the highest selling games back in the 80s or even the 90s. And that's because so many players would not be willing to put up with the grind. They would rather play Pac-Man. They would rather play Tetris. They would rather play, I don't know, Twisted Metal on the PlayStation, right? But they didn't want to play these kinds of games that I'm talking about. So here's some of the games they would like to play that are non-grindy, right? Grind doesn't mean difficult. I want to be really clear about that. Grind doesn't mean difficult. Grind means tedious. That is what the grind is all about. Tediousness. Pac-Man's a very difficult game. Eventually, the point of games like Pac-Man, the arcade, is you're going to die. Like, that's kind of the point, right? Like, you keep on playing and racking up points, and it's endless. There is no final level. You just get as far as you can until you lose all of your lives and the game is over. That's Pac-Man. That's difficult, but it's not tedious. In fact, the movement from one level to the next in these arcade games is the kind of dopamine advancement that keeps players going and trying until they can try no more. Same with games like Tetris. It's a puzzler, and these kinds of games challenge people to think quick, right? You have to kind of move those pieces around, drop them down, get your levels. Tetris is a very, very difficult game, but it's not tedious. It's not grindy. You play until you can play no more and the game is over because all of the different blocks have risen up to the top of the column. And same with games like Super Mario Brothers, a classic platformer. This game is not tedious. This game advances you through 8 worlds. Within those worlds, you have 4 levels. And each time you move through each level, you move on to the next, and the levels aren't very long. Typically speaking, you can beat a level in Super Mario Brothers in about 60 to 90 seconds. That is the kind of progression that really keeps people interested in moving forward. It's the opposite of tedious, right? So let's talk about AI in the hands of game designers then, because we've talked about how there's grindy RPGs, we've talked about games that are not grindy. But let's talk about how AI is used by game designers to try to mitigate the pain involved with the grind. I mentioned earlier that hardcore gamers are a small percentage of the overall gaming population. The majority of gamers don't want to do the grind. Let me be clear about that. And in fact, what we see game designers, particularly in RPGs, do from the 80s right up to the present is try to develop ways to deal with the grind. Why? You want to sell more games. So what do? You make your game more widely accessible to a greater number of gamers. So Exhibit A, let's talk about Destiny of an Emperor briefly. This is a game in 1989, which was one of the first games on the NES, an RPG, to feature what's called an auto-battler, which is where you can allow the AI to take over play for you for the purpose of getting the battle over with quicker, right? Get on with it. Don't make me fight through this over and over again. In this case, you would have the all-out option. All of your guys go out, you fight the bad guys, and the battle can be over with in a matter of seconds, right? Really great. If you were to do it manually as a player, it would take you 2 minutes to get through the battle. This cuts it down to about 10 or 15 seconds. But there is a cost to be paid here. Because what happens in Destiny of an Emperor is you do have the ability to use what are called tactics, which is essentially magic that you would use in the game. If you do all out, your characters don't use any magic. They don't use any special powers. All they do is their standard attack in the game. And the consequence of that is if you try to go all out against a boss monster, you basically lose. You're going to have to fight that boss monster manually and use your spells and your tactics, or you're not going to win. In Dragon Warrior 4, learning from some of the drawbacks of Dragon Warriors 1, 2, and 3, in Dragon Warrior 4, the developers created what's called the tactic system. The tactic system was a way that you could pre-program the behavior of your players so that, or the characters rather, so that when they got into a battle with a monster, they already took prescriptive actions. The drawback being, they wouldn't do anything outside of those actions. So if you ran to a boss monster that could respond to the different things your characters were doing, your characters wouldn't be able to respond in return, and your characters would die, forcing the player to fight the big battles manually. And in Exhibit C, Just Breed, which is a game that was only released in Japan on the Famicom, you had a tactical RPG where you had different armies of individuals, and each army had one hero character in the middle. And you'd have to move that hero character and then very tediously move the other 5 characters with them one by one across the board. But if you decided to move the hero and then enable auto move, the computer would move all your characters for you. But there was a drawback, because the character would also decide to take actions with those characters, which sometimes put them into peril in the middle of other monster groups and had them attacking in ways that would ensure that they would be beaten by the monsters during the next turn. So in other words, you never wanted to use that capability in situations where you needed to engage the monsters directly. There was always a drawback. Empires and puzzles. So why didn't that artificial intelligence put those 5 shields in a row? Why did the artificial intelligence not make the best move? Why in these auto battle situations I just shared does the artificial intelligence not make the best move? And the reason is this. It's intentional. Because by design, an AI must be good enough to mitigate the grind, but it can never be so good that the human just wants to enable it all the time. If an AI is too good in an RPG and always makes the right decisions, players will just stop playing. They'll just let the AI do all the work. And game designers know this, which is why game AI is never that good. It is by design always kind of bad. And that's purposeful so that the players stay engaged and they want to continue playing the game. Players want things that are interesting. And really good AI makes the game really uninteresting. So let's talk about AI then in the hands of players, because that was AI in the hands of the designers. This is where things really start going haywire. If you've never heard of the term botting, let me introduce you to the term botting. This might be a term that you hear a lot more of in the coming years. In video games, a bot or a drone is a type of artificial intelligence that plays a video game in the place of a human. In other words, a software program that basically takes over the controls on your computer and just plays the game for you. Now, these kinds of software programs really came into vogue in the late 90s with the dawn of what are called massively multiplayer open role-playing games, MMORPGs, the first of which were Ultima Online and EverQuest. What's unique about these games is for the first time they brought players together in a social atmosphere where they could do really interesting things like participate in economies within the game, create guilds, associations essentially within the game, and engage in collaborative battles against boss monsters all in one place, right? And almost immediately, both in Ultima and in EverQuest, bots emerged. Programs were written. Players started to let these software programs play their characters in the game. Why would they do this? Well, for a couple of reasons. These games had built into them pretty intense grinds. You would have to kill an awful lot of monsters to get enough gold to buy the kinds of weapons and endgame items that you would want. And it would take hours and hours and hours. And we're not talking about like the 10 hours of Ultima Exodus. We are talking hundreds of hours of grinding out monsters to get basic resources to buy the really great thing that you wanted. That was the business model. And as a result, because it was so intensively grindy, people started botting. They built software programs. And these folks that created these games, they tried to combat it. But the problem with these early games was that these games were run on the client computer. And whenever a piece of software is run on your computer, there's a lot more exploits you can do with software. So come 2004, a game called World of Warcraft was released. This might be a game that many of you have heard of before. World of Warcraft is kind of popular. It's the biggest MMO to ever exist. And World of Warcraft was founded by Blizzard Entertainment. This was a company that had released a game called Diablo in the late 90s. They had released Warcraft several years earlier. This was a very reputable, well-known, and accomplished company by the time World of Warcraft came out. And when World of Warcraft came out, they had learned from Ultima Online and EverQuest not to make a game that was based on a person's computer and a client running on it. They put everything up in the cloud. Now, we have to think about hardware technology, right? We had moved on at this point from a lot of our, 56K modems. How many remember those things? We had moved on from that kind of transfer rate up to better transfer rates, right? We were starting to see cable and different things become available in time, which allowed for these kinds of games to move into the cloud. But guess what? People still bought it. Because there was the same kind of economies and the same kinds of other dynamics in the MMO that encouraged and incentivized people to bot. So here we're looking at an example of one of these software bot programs called WoW Glider, one of the most popular bot programs ever created for an MMORPG. Notice that down here in this corner you have something called Exit on Midgame Warden Update. Warden was specifically an artificial intelligence built by Blizzard to catch botters. And what the botters did is they made programs specifically to get around the anti-botting program. And they embedded it in the botting programs. And it ended up being a cat and mouse game for years and years, right up to the present, actually. Look online, look at botting in World of Warcraft, do a news search in Google, and you will find plenty of articles written in the last 12 months about how bad the botting is in World of Warcraft, 20 years later. What are the negative impacts of these bots on MMORPGs? Why should anyone care? Well, what they do is they essentially crash in-game economies. So if we think about standard basic economics of, like commodities, right? If a market is flooded with coins, for instance, it depreciates the value of everything that is used that is bought with those coins, correct? So if you have bots running 24/7 slaying monsters and getting gold, it floods gold into the system, and then what that allows to happen then is all the different things you would buy in the marketplace within the game start to depreciate in value, right? It basically drives everything down. Or alternatively, if the botters are really, really organized, they use all that gold to buy up everything in the game, and then they, in a very limited way, make it available for a premium cost. Either way, you have an economy that gets thrown every which direction by the botters. You also have opportunities where loot is stolen from different other players, and the way this works is that in a lot of RPGs, what happens is you kind of run around. There's specific nodes and areas where you can kill monsters for really good items. Well, if the bots are always there, they just kill the monsters before the legit players get to kill them themselves and get the kind of loot that they want. And then you also have queues being clogged up. So, players might be waiting in line to get into a really cool area of the game, but the bots are all lined up there and they can't get in. So these are some of the things that really muck up the games with regard to botting. You also have issues, though, in what are the auction houses that appear in a lot of these games, where if you want... Let me back up. If you've ever bought on eBay before, have you ever noticed how the ticker goes down and you want to buy that item in like the last 10 seconds and you swear that you clicked it to get it at the last second, but then you didn't get it? A lot of times that's because there are bot programs that are set up to purchase things on eBay and in auction houses. And these bot programs are precise, down to the millisecond. So that if the program is set up to purchase an item at a certain price, at a certain point in time, it will automate that task of purchase at the very precise moment, thus ensuring that the bot user gets the item off of eBay. Same dynamic in these MMORPGs. The bots go and they invade the auction houses and they start snatching all the good items from the regular players. And the last thing is they can contribute to inflation. I mentioned that earlier. If you have the botters getting all the gold, buying up all the items in the game, and then releasing them in a limited way, it just drives up the value of everything, and then players can't afford to buy anything anymore. So who bots? This is a really important question. There's a company called Steam that builds a software that then provides access to a lot of the games that gamers play online right now. And they have a specific division that focuses on cheaters, focuses on bot users and botters. And what they've said about their research across Steam, across all their games, about those people that use AI in a very flagrant way, is that the majority of them fall into a category that they call casuals. Now let me talk about these just really briefly. Griefers are those kinds of botters that specifically use AI programs to make life miserable on other players. They're just really like sad, awful gremlins in the game, right? Nobody likes them. Some people, though, dislike them so much that they grab the same AI so they can try to go after the griefers. And those are called the vigilantes, right? So you just get angry about that griefer coming after your character, and you just go and get that AI and you go after them, right? Others include achievers. These are gamers that they'll do anything to get the high achievement in the game, including botting and using AI. And you have followers. These are the people that go, everybody's doing it, so I'm going to do it too, right? And they make up a little percentage as well. But by far the greatest number of gamers that use bots are what are called casuals. And according to the folks at Steam, these are the people that bot because it just takes too much time and it's too boring to do all this stuff in the game they would otherwise have to do to get to the end game. In other words, they really dislike the grind. And so they will bot and cheat. Under any other circumstance, they probably wouldn't. But they just don't like how tedious the game is. So what are the parallels between RPGs and education? Now, I'm going to preface this by saying, I am no scholar of late modern European history. But I know enough about some of the history I'm going to talk about here today to help make the connections here in the room. So let's talk about those. Two people you've likely never heard of. One named Wilhelm von Humboldt and one named George von Reiswitz. These two gentlemen were part of what was called the Prussian Reform movement in the early 19th century in Germany. Now, Wilhelm von Humboldt was a person who was, at that day and age, an aristocrat. He was a person that was a diplomat to other countries in Europe. And he was also charged with developing some of the reforms around education. Now, the Prussian Reform movement was oftentimes recognized internally as being a movement about three things. That was arms, knowledge, and constitution. So basically, military, education, and laws. That was the Prussian Reform movement. It was brought about because after the Napoleonic defeat of Prussia in 1806, the Prussians looked at themselves internally and said, we just got beat by the French. We need to do something, right? And they said, this is how we will go about it. Arms, knowledge, and constitution. Wilhelm von Humboldt was the primary person in charge of knowledge, which was education. And what he proposed was, for the first time, a compulsory education system that would look not at opportunities for education just among aristocrats, but in fact it would be mandatory for every Prussian citizen to have basic education, beginning at the age of 5. Age 5, age 6, age 7, age 8, and they would be grouped into those age groupings. And it didn't matter if you were the son of a nobleman or you were the son of a peasant. You were going to be part of that. It also included girls, too. So we should mention that it was not just boys, which prior to that time, oftentimes it would have been just men. That's where the primary emphasis would have been. But in von Humboldt's opinion, we needed all citizens in Prussia at that time to be educated. And the reason why is because if they were obedient and if they had fidelity to the state, then what would happen is that they could build up a military over time that then could successfully beat the French. Okay, now this is also the first time we saw teacher schools that were employed. So the teachers that would teach all of the citizens then would actually be professionally taught. This then translated over into the military at the time, where the military schools rose up. And the military schools had trained teachers. And the idea was that if you had young people move through the K-12, well, I'm going to say K-12, the system that would have been up to adulthood, which would have been younger than our 18 at that time, they would be prepared to move into the military. And directly into a military school, over time, you would create many, many smart soldiers and lieutenants and generals, and then you would have a better military force. Now, at the same time, there was a gentleman named George von Reiswitz. Interesting guy. He built a game in 1812 because he thought one of the best ways we could train our military would be if we built some war games, and then we wouldn't have to be in wartime training all of our military troops and our generals. We could have them playing war games and preparing strategically ahead of time. Now, prior to this, the militaries in Prussia were led by aristocrats, and they were generally formatted around the idea that you would muster citizens together whenever wartime came around, and then the aristocrats would lead them, right? That, of course, doesn't get you a very disciplined, well-prepared army. So using war games, the war game Kriegspiel was developed, and it was embedded in all of the different military schools across the Prussian Empire at that time. And over time then, the use of Kriegspiel was used to prepare the generals, which was then used to prepare the junior military officers, and then was used to prepare the military more generally over time. Now, the last thing I want to share on this before I move along is that in 1843, there was a gentleman named Horace Mann from the United States who had been a U.S. congressional person at that time that went over to Prussia. Horace Mann saw what was going on in Prussia and came back to the United States and told his friends, wow, guess what I saw over in Prussia? I saw young people in school, very obedient, fidelity to the state. Wow, we should do that here in the United States. What if we could create compulsory education in the U.S.? And indeed, Horace Mann, with many other influential people at the time, developed what would become today our modern K-12 system. It was all built off of the work of Wilhelm von Humboldt that Horace Mann and others observed in Prussia at the time. Now, there are a lot of similarities then in progression systems that were developed at the time in Prussia. So let's think about the Prussian military. We have Soldat up to captain, up to major, up to Oberst, up to general of the military. And again, they were modeling their education system at the time off their military and vice versa. So they developed progression systems in education as well, age 5, age 6, age 7. These were the grades in the Prussia Reform movement. In RPGs, we see a very similar thing. We see progression systems in classes and other areas of RPGs. And I'm going to talk more about why that is. Here we're seeing the progression system of a basic wizard in Dungeons & Dragons. There are other things that are very, very similar in the progression systems that come around, and in similarities between what would be MMOs and education itself. So let's talk about MMOs. MMOs, especially MMORPGs today, a standard quest goes something like this. Get the quest from an NPC, travel to another location, go to a node, gather some resources, repeat it a few more times, go back to the NPC, turn the resources in, and get your reward, right? Which could be an item or a level or something else. In education, we see things like get the assignment in class from an instructor, read a book or chapter, write a response to a chapter question, repeat it a few more times, turn it back in, and get a reward. So there are similarities that have commonly cropped up between RPGs and education that are like this, but there's a lot more too. So check this out. What's the scariest boss monster in this image? This guy or this guy? Let me tell you this. When I was growing up, one of these things was absolutely the stuff of my nightmares. The other one I just killed in video games, right? How about some other parallels in RPGs? Multiple contiguous play sessions, and you have multiple continuous learning sessions. You're going to have a dungeon master, referee, or an umpire. You also have teachers, facilitators, mentors. Guilds, student clubs, associations, and social groups. It goes on and on. This is not an exhaustive list. Now, one of the things that I neglected to share earlier was this in the history. I mentioned that Horace Mann went to Prussia and brought back the education system to the United States. But there's a common pedigree between modern RPGs and education. Here's what that pedigree looks like. We already know our education system is modeled after the Prussian system. Krillspieg spread throughout Prussia, all the military schools. In the 1870s, the French invaded Prussia again. Guess what happened? The Prussian military absolutely trounced the French. Like, it wasn't even close. The discipline of the Prussian military was unbelievable, and word spread quickly across the world about how disciplined and how well organized the Prussian military was. There was a gentleman in the American military by the last name of Totten who picked up on what was going on over in Prussia, and he was introduced to Kriegspiel. And Totten developed a game for the US military that was called Strategos in the 1870s. And he published a book on how to play Strategos. Strategos, like Kriegspiel, included something called an umpire or a referee in it, which was basically an objective person on the side that would manage all of the rules of the game for the players who were involved. And Strategos was used across the American military for about 2 decades. And then it kind of went dormant. And for about 60 years, nobody really heard about Strategos. In 1963, there was a copy of Strategos at the University of Minnesota. And a guy by the name of Dave Wesley went and checked it out and brought it home. Dave Wesley eventually went on to create Braunsteins. In 1966, a guy named Dave Arneson independently went to the University of Minnesota and checked out Strategos and started building games off of what he found in Strategos. And of course, the rest is history, right? We know how RPGs develop after that with Arneson and Gygax. And we also know that the progression system was fundamentally one of the things that changed the game and created RPGs. Now, let's also not forget that a lot of these gentlemen at the time that were working on these games were relatively young, and their body of experience had been experience in the American education system. These gentlemen were all in their young to mid-20s or even teens at the time, and so their lives had been heavily influenced by American education and the progression systems that we have. once they were influenced by the progression systems and the other things that were found in Strategos, back to Kriegspiel and other things, you can see where all of the different pedigree starts to come together. So it's not surprising then that we see so many parallels between modern education and RPGs. So what are the lessons from RPG designers and publishers? Let's talk about those, right? Especially as it relates to artificial intelligence. I want to share a quote here from a really well-known developer named Soren Johnson, which is, "Many players cannot help approaching a game as an optimization puzzle. Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. There is nothing more optimizational than using a bot to gather all your resources for you. That is as efficient and optimized as you're going to get." And we might think for a second about the idea that given the opportunity, students will optimize the learning out of education. So lesson one from the gaming industry around the use of AI. The first is, if you have too many bots, the answer is to hire more humans. So what this looks like in MMORPGs is around what are called community managers. One of the best ways to combat flagrant use of AI in MMORPGs is to hire players that go in and all they do is communicate with all the other players, build relationships, such that the other players feel comfortable tipping them off when they see another player using a bot and using AI. In other words, the culture becomes not one of I'm snitching on another player. It becomes a culture of I'm part of a community that wants to maintain its authenticity and integrity. And I can now do that because the creator and the company is building that with me, and I find that to be a more comfortable place than trying to stick together with all the players who are doing the botting. Another example is, when I wanted to share this, there actually is a gaming analog for AI detection. I mentioned earlier that WoW Warden, over 20 years, has not been particularly effective, right? Nor has any AI that's been used in RPGs to combat AI. It is whack-a-mole, right? This is the analog version of AI detection. So I just want to be clear that that is a lesson that we learned from MMORPGs, is that you really can't use AI to combat AI. You will constantly, the botters will constantly be one step ahead of you. There's just no getting ahead. Lesson number two is create proportional consequences, then follow through on them. What we see in particularly MMORPGs is this, is that if you have a system set up where you give a hand slap to a botter, right? You say, you're going to be suspended for 24 hours and then you can come on back, right? Those players will continue to bot. They will get their hand slapped as many times as you're willing to slap it. The way that you actually get people, especially the casuals, to stop botting, those 75% I was talking about, is you develop a system whereby the consequences of botting are so severe that they actually seem more costly than if they just went ahead and kept on playing the game authentically and not use bots at all. Again, if you are far into a game, you have 40 hours, 60 hours invested into it, and you bot and you get banned, and then you have to start all over again, that's a big time investment, right? You don't want to start all over again. So you want to make sure that you have consequences that are proportional and that you follow through on them immediately. And in our system in Minnesota State, this is a conversation we're having in an ongoing way. To what extent do we develop consequences for the use of AI in courses that are proportional to the kind of use, and proportional and fair to the students? I'm not sure that we've necessarily figured that out yet, but in MMORPG gaming, they definitely have been looking at that, and they have data that suggests the best way to do that, at least in that context. Lesson number three is embed AI assistance or assistance. And I'm trying to speed up a little bit here, being mindful of the time. There's a lot of work being done here in this picture that we're looking at, all right? We have our fantasy elements and the dragon. That's not what I want you to pay attention to. I want you to pay attention to AI and that really, really poorly created version of OpenStax right there. In RPGs, in the history of RPGs, we have looked at auto battlers. We have looked at ways that developers have embedded systems that alleviate or mitigate the grind in pretty significant ways, that create accessibility to players. For any of you that attended Bruce's presentation yesterday, Bruce, are you in the room here? I don't know where Bruce is. If Bruce is here, Bruce is doing some really excellent work at his college in the way of in embedding artificial intelligence in his courses. In the future, I think we're going to see more of this. And part of the reason we're going to see more of this is because of the developments in AI that we're watching in real time occur, and what is being suggested about the best way to develop these bots. What we know is if you want, at this moment in time, if you want an AI to hallucinate less or not at all, the way that you do that is through a method called retrieval augmented generation. And what retrieval augmented generation is it's where you provide files, you provide things for the AI to use, and then you tell the AI to be very strict in its responses, only using the materials you've given it. In other words, don't use your training data, don't use any web data, use these documents and nothing else. And what we find in those situations is that the AI is quite good. It really sticks to it, and it hallucinates very little, usually not at all. And why that's important for us as educators who care about textbook affordability is, there's been a lot of talk about what the future of open educational resources look like. Here's what I think it's going to look like. I think it's going to look like video game consoles. And what I mean by that is in the future what we're going to see are a lot of marketplaces for pre-constructed bots, artificial intelligence, that you can pull off the shelf like a console, like an NES console. And then what you're going to have is your OER, which is like your cartridge, and you're going to stick it into the bot and push it down. And this is very important because as educators, we're probably going to have access to hundreds of bots for education. Let's just say we have 12 bots that are all biology focused, but they're all a little different biology focused. You'll pick the bot that you want, and then you'll load your OER into it. And then that will inform that bot. That's a future that we're already seeing come together in the technologies that are being released right now. We don't have anyone that I've seen specifically doing it and providing it as a service, but I don't think that we're far away from that. And from MMORPGs, we know that embedding that assistance in games through things like auto battlers, that works. That alleviates the grind. That gets people playing the game. But you don't want to do too much AI, because another lesson is that too much AI is bad. Very, very bad. Grand Saga bad. Grand Saga is an MMORPG that's closing down this month. And one of the primary reasons it's closing down this month is because it provided too many ways for players to not play the game. You could automate your character going and completing quests. You could automate your character going and buying things. You could automate your character doing everything. I mean, you could automate the entire game. And as a consequence, nobody wanted to play it. Everybody tried it for a day or two and then left because it just wasn't that interesting. Because it turns out that too much automation is really uninteresting. And ultimately, people don't want everything automated. What they want is they want interesting experiences. So my final thoughts for you today, I want to take it back to the tabletop. And this is really just a comment I want to make for all of us in the room today. We're experiencing a hype cycle right now around artificial intelligence. We experienced a similar hype cycle with the dawn of online learning. We experienced a similar hype cycle with other things that we've had, like MOOCs. MOOCs are a great example. There was a hype cycle around that where for a certain period of time, everybody was predicting the end of higher education. We're in a hype cycle right now with AI. And when I talk to colleagues across our system, there are a couple different kinds of colleagues that I speak with, and there's a lot of folks in between, but the two I want to talk about are the folks who are really strong advocates for AI, which is we got to go full into AI. We got to put AI everywhere, right? We got to do AI. And if you're not doing AI, you're not keeping up with the times. And then we have others who are saying, no, we have to keep AI away. We have to defend ourselves, protect ourselves from AI, protect our students from AI, protect learning from AI. And there's a lot of folks in between. In the RPG world, I just came from a conference in Milwaukee this last week called the Midwest Gaming Convention. Now, the Midwest Gaming Classic is primarily for retro gamers, hardcore players like me, right? Video gamers. There was an entire big floor of the Baird Center dedicated to tabletop gaming. Why is that? And the reason why is because in the RPG community, there are no lines drawn between who is a video gamer and who is a tabletop gamer. It's usually the same gamer. And the reason why is because sometimes gamers, they don't want to play video games anymore. They want to take it back to the tabletop. And sometimes tabletop gamers, they want to go and they want a video game, those games that they really, really like. And the developers of video games and the developers of tabletop games, guess what they do? They look at each other's stuff all the time. And they're also sometimes the same person, developing video games and board games. And this, I think, is the reality for us as educators with AI. Even in your own courses, some courses you might determine are really well suited for AI. Other times, you're just taking it back to the tabletop. So I'm going to leave you with today a video that is not advancing here, but it's a 40-second video from one Noam Chomsky. Maybe you've heard of that guy. He is a little cynical in this video.
Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class. And you want to make it and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience.
That was 1991. It's surprising how much Chomsky seemed to know about leveling up progression systems, tediousness, the grind, and other concepts in that 40 seconds. Thank you. I think it's time for questions. Do we have time for many questions? Maybe just a little bit of time, right?
Good morning. My name is Nakia Stampley, higher ed expat, but one of those 5 to 10% that is considered a hardcore gamer. And I have a question for you. So so you brought up Steam, which I thought was a really fantastic example, because if you get caught botting on any of the Steam games, they will straight up send a SWAT team to come and kill you. And so that is something that is very serious. And so Steamers, those in the PC gaming community who use the Steam platform, we are very aware of, like, hey, those consequences are very bad. They won't just wipe the one game you botted in, they will wipe all of the games that you botted in, even if you didn't bot in them. So when it comes to transferring this of making the consequences match the offense and making sure that we follow through, when we transfer that to education, it's not quite the same as gaming, where it's like, low stakes, you're just playing a game. With education, and we're making that, you know, when it comes time to make an example of a student who bought it, that is the concern that I'm starting to see, because it's like that first offense that happens if we say we're going to have these strict, like, you know, botting, like, you know, the wizard that's going to come and get you, the warden. How do we make sure that we are making sure that the offense matches the crime, but we are not doing it so severe on the first one that that pendulum swung so far in the other direction that we have students giving up on education?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have a lot of work to do in this area to figure this all out. You know, the SEAM team, one of the things they say is that when they look at the different profiles they have of, you know, the griefers and the casuals and others, what they generally say is that the casuals, the followers, and bot users like that, you don't ever want to lose them, ever. They might be botting right now, but in a different design setting, under a different set of circumstances, those will all be authentic gamers. The problem is that the design of the game itself is incentivizing them to bot. And this is where we need to take a look at the design in those games, and we need to look at the design in education, and we need to start having serious conversations about what not incentivizing the use of AI looks like in education. And when we do that, and we get to that point, then I think we start talking about proportional consequences, right? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to develop consequences that is either going to alienate or worse, cause those casuals, those followers, those other botters to leave the game. And I'm just going to say this, I mean, there's a lot of things we're talking about in this presentation around hardcore gamers, my people. Let me ask you this. Does everybody know what your hardcore students look like? You know what your hardcore students look like. And I'm part of a couple communities. I shouldn't say I'm part of them. I kind of follow them online among educators where they talk about an awful lot of things they're unhappy with about education. Some of the things they say about their students are really, really awful. I have heard from colleagues in our system that they are seeing up to 60% or higher usage of AI on examinations. And some people are so irritated about the number of cheaters. I think we need to start rethinking who those students are that we're calling cheaters. Just in the same way the STEAM team reanalyzes the casuals. And they ask themselves, why are these people using bots in our game? And why are they not authentically having fun, right? These are conversations we need to have. When we have these conversations, we start thinking about what it is students are using AI for and how they're using it on a more prescriptive level. I think we can start talking about what proportional consequences look like. Because I would contend that every student using AI in a way that is academically dishonest right now is not equal. I think we need to better understand the circumstances as to why they're using it. And I want to talk about, too, some weaknesses in the theory that this is all about the grind. I think all of us know that it's not all about the grind. I would think a lot of cases it is about the grind. But, if you are a young mother of 2 children working 30, 35 hours a week and trying to get your education because you want to provide a better life for your children someday, if you're not getting your assignments done and you're missing class, I'm not sure there's any kind of design work you're going to do on your courses that's going to change that situation. But, nevertheless, we need to look at the design of education and talk about what that design should look like given the advent of AI. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. I'm not a hardcore gamer. I'm a casual. Thank you. Just a thought sprang to mind as you were speaking and talking about the challenges of the grind. I'm a fan of Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken. I don't know if you're familiar with that. She draws not similar comparisons, but it has a conversation in there talking about why gaming appeals to people. And for her, what it comes down to is feedback. Right? You talked about how, there's the grind, and sort of the flip side of that coin is people aren't getting useful feedback in the real world. But in a game, you follow through on your quest, you get your reward, you see yourself, the number goes up, and you don't necessarily get to see that in real life, right, as you develop a skill or work through a challenge. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, about how AI can also create an opportunity for us as educators to provide better, more timely feedback and tighten that feedback loop for our students, and improve education in that way. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm going to kind of address 2 things here, and I may come back and ask you about the second part again, the last question. But the first thing I wanted to get back to is something you said about certainty and progression. Certainty that if you just work hard enough, eventually you will get the achievement. There's a lot of comfort in the idea that if you just put the work in, you will eventually get the achievement. If you get 1,000 experience points, you will go to level 2. That is certain. If you go and you farm this particular node for that really great item 25 times, and it has an approximately 4% drop rate, you're eventually going to get that, right? There is no such certainty made in the progression system in education. No such certainty. And in fact, this is part of the challenge when you have an intrinsic motivational system that provides no certainty, is that it forces the players, students, to make really hard choices about what they're willing to take a chance on and what they're not. And in education, it costs money once you get to higher ed. Once you're there, you can work really, really hard, but you're not guaranteed the achievement, no matter how hard you work necessarily. We've seen this in games in Minnesota State. We had a game that we funded several years back called Limit Breaks. It was about limits and calculus. And we had students, about 30, in that game playing for an entire semester. And we looked at the analytics data. What we noticed is that we had students that were spending, on average, an hour and 90 minutes maybe, 90 minutes in the game. I think we had students that were spending up to 6, 7 hours in the game. And we looked at the data about how students were achieving in that game. What you found is that the students that were investing 60 to 90 minutes were high achievers, and the students that were investing 6, 7 hours were low achievers. And the reason why is because they were playing the game, they were working, they were trying, they weren't getting anywhere. They were just spinning their wheels the entire time. And in that game format, they didn't have the kind of interventions from a human that could help them along. And so they were stuck. So that's an example of how you have a system that guarantees no achievement for time investment. RPGs generally guarantee achievement. And so you can use that to your advantage in RPG construction. Your second question was about artificial intelligence and how we can use it in the classroom for tutoring, right? Here's where I think it helps and why I'm using this analogy. Our students in limits breaks put in all that time, and the problem was there was no intervention available to them. Not that was timely enough, right? Certainly the faculty member was available by email and stuff, but for whatever reasons we don't know, the students didn't reach out for that help. But what if they had an AI companion there at that point in limits that they were having a hard time they could ask a question to? What if it was in the game? How would that have changed the experience for the student advancing through that game? What if, as Conmigo with Khan Academy does, that AI was not just there to give them the answer, but the AI was embedded with the question or the challenge that was being posed to the student and could help actually promote critical thinking towards an answer within that game? Those students that were stuck in our limits game for 6, 7 hours, not really getting very far, might have indeed completed that game if they had that just-in-time support. I think that is in the future where AI assistance, as I was talking about in number 3, can really come in handy. It's not an auto-battler, right? But what it's there to do is help you through some of those really challenging components. It could also help you alleviate the grind if the grind is designed into the coursework itself. Now, there's a whole nother conversation we can have about what the grind looks like in an educational setting, right? Like in the classroom. I think that's a conversation I want to have. But my hope today is that everyone takes away this from this talk. There are other circumstances out there where artificial intelligence is being used and has been around for a long, long time. And in some of those circumstances, like RPGs and MMORPGs, the design elements, the building blocks of an RPG are uncannily similar to education. And hopefully today I've demonstrated part of the reason why that is. We should look for some inspiration in those places where we can to help give us ideas, not necessarily to replicate one-to-one, but to look at some of those lessons I shared at the end today and start asking ourselves some important questions about education. And maybe give us a tip on something we should try if we're not already trying it.
I'm a mathematician from the University of Minnesota, and AI has been around for a long time. We have calculators, we have laptops, then we have spreadsheets, and so we now have a much greater capacity to allow technology to do the tedious stuff, and therefore we can do more, and this is good. The AI has been very good for computation. But it's gotten to the point that my 10th grade daughter, my iPhone can get an A in her math class because you just take a picture of the homework and the AI can do the computational part of stuff. So as the new AI comes along and does the next thing with language and all that sort of stuff, what remains for education? What remains for humans? What's the safe stuff for humans that humans will be able to do 40 years from now that computers won't yet be able to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. One that I would preface by saying your guess is probably as good as mine, but I'll do my best. Generative artificial intelligence, as we are currently experiencing it, it is game-breaking for education. I'm just going to say that explicitly. This is game-breaking technology. This is game-breaking technology like World of Warcraft developers encountered and built Warden around, right? And RPG developers have been trying to combat this for decades, which is why I think it's helpful for us to think about this. In my opinion, what artificial intelligence can do, and has been proven to do, are a lot of the things that we would consider rote tasks, rote things. Tedious things, if you will, right? Not so different from grindy things. That tends to be what artificial intelligence is very, very good at. Now, the current generative artificial intelligence based around the construction of language is a different beast than the other artificial intelligence that have existed since the 40s and 50s, right? I think we can all recognize that. These particular kinds of systems are really, really good at emulating performance. The entire purpose of the newer generative artificial intelligence is to replicate human performance in a way that is indistinguishable from a human. Now, that's performance. If we think empirically about this, what's happening are these things are reconstructing what we can empirically analyze in human behavior. The outputs, the writing, right? The image creation, the design stuff. It can do all of that. If it has a model to work from, it can reconstruct it. But what it can't reconstruct are a lot of the psycho-emotional things that we experience as human beings. And there are a lot of areas that we're already realizing are going to be really hard for artificial intelligence to infiltrate, especially in the way of robotics. Let me give you an example of this that I often share. There's been a number of studies that have been conducted around putting robots in restaurants, all right? Usually as food runners. Makes a lot of sense, right? Like the robot can go back to the cook can like whip things up, put it on the robot will bring it out to the table, right? I mean, it seems to make sense. What we find out in these robots, they're not even androids. They're not even human shaped. They're not even trying to look like a human, like the Terminator, really scary stuff, right? They're just like these box robot things. After a few weeks, these robots have all kinds of dents in them. They look really haggard and beat up, and they're not doing so well. And it turns out, you look at video footage, and the customers are like kicking them, getting mad at them for forgetting. They won't go back and get the cream for the coffee, that kind of thing. I mean, it's just these things are just not getting the work done, right? And not only are they not getting like the rote work done, they're not able to like emotionally comfort the customer. They're not able to console them. They're not able to say I'm sorry, right? And certainly not in an authentic way, even if they were able to. But what's even more important is what the video footage shows about the workers. The workers are the ones who really kick the robots and beat them up. Like the workers, the servers, the cooks, others really hate these robots because they keep on making mistakes, and the customers don't like them, the workers don't like. Nobody likes these things, right? And part of the reason why people don't like them is not just because they underperform on the rote tasks, but it's because when they underperform on the rote tasks, they fail to follow up with the kind of psycho-emotional follow-up that a human being needs to manage that situation when their temperature is high and their heart is beating fast. And the reason why I think we're unlikely to see artificial intelligence fill that in anytime soon is because as human beings, we're very, very good at identifying cheaters. Evolutionarily, it's embedded in us. Like that's part of what we are programmed to do. Even if we miss, we usually are able to catch things that don't seem right. And when we look at androids that are meant to look like human beings, we tend to look a little side-eyed at them and mistrust them. We see this in a lot of sci-fi films. It actually plays out in real life too. Go to some of these conferences where they have live androids and just watch the number of people who are like really creeped out by some of these things, right? I mean, we are not comfortable. And I don't know that we're going to be comfortable anytime soon. So for education, what I would say, and this is going to be a real hot take, again, anybody's idea of what the future looks like is as good as mine. I really do think that we're going to see a turn back towards the humanities. And the reason why is because as we think about what it means to be human beings, this is my little quote here I use. For anybody that's a fan of the 1990s, actually the late 80s, 90s rock band White Zombie, they had a song called More Human Than Human. And when we have these things that are trying to perform exactly like us and be like us, and that's the purpose, right? Indistinguishable from human performance. We need to start asking ourselves about what makes us unique. What makes us more human than just the rote things and the outputs that we create and the things that are empirically observable in this world? That's where I think the future of education is going to be focused. That's where I think the value is going to be found in the workplace. even as robots replace workers. And we start asking ourselves what those new jobs are going to be. Those new jobs are going to focus on whatever more human than human is. So that's my response. We'll see what happens. All right. And I see, are we still okay on time? Just checking. One more? Okay, thank you. Please.
Thanks. The only game I play in my life was chess. And so just to make sure I get the most out of this talk, do you have anything you want to say? I know you didn't prepare about that, about chess and the games that you kind of investigate and think about. Thank you.
Yeah. I feel like I planted this question. I didn't. Thank you so much. I love chess players. I do have some thoughts on that. In fact, I think these are some potent ones to share. The first thing is just kind of a factoid. Kriegspiel in the Prussian Empire was developed specifically because chess itself was not effective. It was not a way, it wasn't realistic enough. Chess has been a war game that's been around for centuries, right? But it didn't emulate actual field conditions effectively for military use, which is why Kriegspiel was invented. It was basically the alternative to chess at the time, right? And it accomplished what was needed for the Prussian military. So there was a Go player. This isn't chess, but a Go player that I'll talk about. I could talk about how AI defeated chess grandmasters in the late 90s, but I'm going to talk about AlphaGo, an AI developed by DeepMind in the 2010s that I believe it was 2017. I think it was 2017. AlphaGo was pitted up against a number of grandmaster Go players from across the world, all right? And over a period of 3 months, culminating in AlphaGo's confrontation with the #1 Go player in the world, Lee Sedol, AlphaGo had beaten every single Go player, like in the top 50 ranks. There was one guy that was, I can't remember his name, I apologize, but he was like ranked 35, maybe 40, somewhere in that range, and he lost to AlphaGo several times, could not beat AlphaGo. AlphaGo was just doing things that the player had never seen before, sometimes things that didn't make a lot of sense. And over the next 3 months, that player advanced like 15 ranks. And if you know anything about being like a top 50 player in anything, advancing even 1 rank is kind of a big deal. I'll come back to this. When AlphaGo played Lee Sedol, who was the #1 player at that time, Lee Sedol played 5 games. Lee Sedol lost game 1, game 2, game 3, won game 4, and then lost game 5. And afterwards, this was a big deal, by the way, over in Korea. Like, it was national attention. Go's a really big deal. People were like live watching this, thousands of people in the room where Lee Sedol was playing AlphaGo, the AI, right? And they asked Lee Sedol afterwards, they said, you know, you really got beat pretty bad by AlphaGo in some of those games. You know, how did it feel to get, you know, dominated, 4-1 by this artificial intelligence system, and you are the #1 Go player in the world? Like, what does that say about humanity? And Lee Sedol said this. He said, you know what? I was thankful for the opportunity to play AlphaGo because it's making me a better player. It makes me want to be a better player. It turns out when they went to the gentleman that had advanced like 15 ranks, he said the exact same thing. He started working harder after he played the AI. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. When we look at some of the research that's been done, most of it's been done, by the way, over in Korea and Japan. American researchers haven't been as interested in RPGs and gaming and things like this for research. Not in the same way. When you have an intrinsic system that's based on points, based on achievements that are measurable, what happens in a lot of those systems is that when players come up against like unbeatable AI, they tend to just like tap out and they're done with it. Like achievement systems themselves, like leaderboards and stuff, are really demoralizing for gamers. Like we're addicted to them in a really bad way, and they're also really unhealthy for us. But in something like chess and Go, those have imposed extrinsic or intrinsic motivation systems. I'm sorry, I messed it up. Not extrinsic. Extrinsic is the point-based. Intrinsic motivation systems. Those particular games like chess, they don't keep points, right? As you move through the game and you move your pieces, you lose a piece, your opponent loses a piece, someone wins the game, but like there's really no record along the way. You don't gain points for removing a piece specifically. And in those kinds of systems, what we see in those intrinsic motivation systems like chess and Go is that when players go up against AI, it tends to motivate them more as opposed to demotivate them. Whereas in extrinsic motivation systems that are based on points where the player has to sit there and watch how bad they're beaten, like point by point by point, players tend to check out. So there's a tension there, right? If we look at gaming and we think about our own education system, I mean, we are an education system that is based on extrinsic motivation with achievements, with points, with other sorts of things that we assign. How we navigate that with AI, I think, is something we need to think about. And I think there's some things that can sort of guide some of our thinking in gaming. I don't think it's going to be one-to-one in that regard because chess and Go are not like education, not in the way RPGs are, right? So we definitely have to work that out. But that's what I would share and what we could potentially learn from some of those games. Thank you.